A weapon hums against the back of a neck. Four guards, one human face down on a floor built by a civilization older than fire itself. Somewhere behind him, a light that shouldn't exist is coming back on. Zoom out first. A warship drifting through black, ancient, and silent, older than human memory. Zoom in past its gleaming hull, past sealed corridors, reconfiguring like something breathing down to one chamber, one table, one girl the color of ash. Now hold there. Because 30 seconds ago, none of this was happening. 30 seconds ago, he was just a medic, told to observe, told not to touch, told above everything else not to be here. He touched anyway. And whatever just started inside that dying girl's veins, whatever just woke up an Empire's guards, whatever just put a charged weapon against his skin is only the beginning of what his hands are about to cost him. The blade doesn't lift. Not yet. Part 1, the accidental touch, Silas. I was not supposed to be in that corridor. I need you to understand that first, before anything else. Because everything that happened after started with me standing somewhere I had no business standing. Corporal Silas Rourke, field medic, assigned to the Human Observer Delegation aboard the Thessari Royal Cruiser Radiant Ascendant. 11 years, that's how long humanity had been part of the galactic community. 11 years in a galaxy where empires counted their histories in hundreds of thousands. We were new. We were small. And my job, my only job, was to observe. Take notes, stay quiet, touch nothing. I broke every rule in about 40 seconds. The power failed without warning. One moment I was walking toward the observation deck. The next darkness, the floor tilted. My shoulder hit a wall that had not been there a second before. Emergency lights flickered on, pale blue, cold. The ship's systems groaned somewhere beneath my feet, a vibration I felt in my teeth more than heard. The Thessari built their ships to reconfigure during emergencies. Walls that moved, corridors that sealed and opened like something breathing. And the breach behind me had closed, which meant the only way forward was through a door I had never seen before. I should have waited, except the air was thinning, except somewhere nearby pressure was dropping, which meant a breach, which meant I didn't have the luxury of waiting for someone brave and important to come find me. So I moved into a room that was freezing, my breath fogged in front of me. The walls here were supposed to glow every Thessari medical chamber did, but this one sat dark and dead, like something had reached in and drained the light out of it. And then I saw her, a girl, on a table. Thessari, obviously the height even lying down the sharp architecture of her face. But wrong. Everything about her was wrong. Thessari's skin was supposed to shimmer. Silver sliding into violet, shifting with mood, with health, with life. Hers was gray, ash gray, cracked along the arms and throat like dried clay left too long in the sun. And beneath the cracks, where there should have been rivers of violet light running under the skin, nothing. Dark veins, black threads where light used to live. Machines surrounded her, equipment I didn't recognize. A single drone hovering above her chest, sensors angled down in something that looked less like monitoring and more like a vigil. It was watching her die. I knew who she was before anyone told me. You get briefed on royal families even as a low-ranking medic. Princess Solène Vantier, 72 years old, barely past childhood by Thessari counting. Daughter of Emperor Kailos, dying of something called the Ashen Fade. I'd read the file. A degenerative collapse. The disease didn't attack organs, it attacked communication, the resonance frequency Thessari cells use to talk to each other. Imagine an orchestra. Now imagine the conductor vanishing. One musician at a time forgetting the song. 40 days of decline. No cure. Not in Thessari medicine. Not anywhere in the galactic archive. I moved closer. I don't know why. I had nothing to offer her. Basic xenobiology, emergency triage, enough training to know when to apply pressure and when to step back and let real doctors work. But my feet moved anyway, because that's what medics do. We move toward the wounded, It isn't bravery, it's reflex. The cable caught my boot before I saw it. My balance went. My hand shot out to catch myself, and my palm landed on her forearm. Bare skin against gray, cracked skin. 2 seconds, maybe 3. Then I yanked my hand back like I'd touched a live wire because I remembered too late exactly where I was. Touching Thesari royalty without invitation was a capital offense. Not a fine, not an apology letter. Execution. And a very awkward diplomatic memo explaining why one of Earth's medics had been vaporized on a state visit. I started backing toward the door. Then the drone made a sound I'd never heard. Not an alarm, a rising tone, like a question asked in a language made of pure frequency. The monitors flickered. Data scrolled across crystalline panels, fast, frantic, like the machines themselves didn't believe what they were reading. I looked at her arm, at the place my hand had been. The gray was fading, not everywhere, just there. A patch the size of my palm, the cracks closing slow like frost melting off glass, and beneath it, faint but unmistakable, a pulse of violet light moved through her vein. Once, then again, then stronger. The drone screamed. The door exploded inward. 4 guards, weapons raised, veins blazing crimson, the color I would learn later of threat response. I was on the floor before I finished turning around, face pressed to cold crystal, something sharp against my neck. Someone shouted in Thesari. My translator implant strained to keep up. Fragments only. Intruder. Contamination. The princess. Breach protocol. I was going to die on that floor. I was certain of it. One guard's weapon shifted from restraint to execution angle. I felt the heat of its charge building against my skin. And from that angle cheek, against the floor, I could still see her arm. Still see the violet light. Spreading. Doing something impossible in a room full of people about to end my life over it. The door opened again, slower this time. A voice, one word. My implant rendered it simply. Stop. The guard froze, the weapon pulled back half an inch. I breathed. It tasted like metal and cold stone. Orson entered. I knew the name before I saw the face. Surgeon Prime. 6 arms, a reputation that bordered on myth. Personal physician to the royal family since the first symptoms appeared. He walked past the guards without looking at them, all 6 hands clasped at his chest in the posture of deep concentration. He stopped at the table, studied the monitors, studied her arm. Then he looked at me, still pinned to the floor. What did you do? I fell, I said. I tripped on a cable. My hand landed on her arm. That's all. I swear that's all. He studied me the way you'd study a stain you couldn't quite explain. Then he turned back to the readouts. Cellular reversal in the contact zone. He said quiet enough that the guards leaned in to hear him. 0.3%. Silence. In 40 days of treatment, with every resource this empire possesses, we have achieved 0. Not once. Not in any tissue. Not by any method. He looked at me again. And you tripped. I tripped. He ordered the guards to lift me. Not release me. Just lift me. My arms stayed locked behind my back while he ran a scanner over her arm. Over my hands. Over the empty air between us. Then he straightened. Bring him to the Emperor. I don't remember the walk to the throne room in detail. Fear compresses time, turns minutes into a blur of corridors and boots on crystal floor. What I remember is the door, 30 feet tall, carved with scenes from a history longer than my species had existed, and I remember it opening. Emperor Kailos was enormous. I knew Thesari ran tall, but the Emperor was something past tall. 8 feet of silver-skinned authority seated on a throne that seemed to grow directly out of the ship. 4 eyes, all 4, locked on me the second I crossed the threshold. I felt those eyes the way you feel gravity. Not a sensation, a fact. Something that pins you in place and reminds you without a word exactly how small you are. Beside him stood his eldest son, Prince Thranor, sharp-featured, tall even by Thessari standards, and radiating a hostility that needed no translation at all. He looked at me the way you'd look at something that crawled onto your dinner plate. Orson presented the data. Formal Thessari, my implant translated in a flat clinical tone that stripped every word of its weight. Cellular reversal, contact event, anomalous bioelectric signature, 0.3%. The Emperor listened without moving. When Orson finished, the room went so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Nothing else. Thrainer spoke first. Execute the human. He violated the sanctity of a royal medical chamber. The law is clear. The law is clear, the Emperor agreed. His voice moved like tectonic plates. Slow, deep, but the data is also clear. He looked at Orson. You are certain I have watched her decline for 40 days, my Emperor. Every number falling. Until today. What this human did in 2 seconds of accidental contact, I could not achieve in 40 days of deliberate effort. I do not understand it. I cannot deny it. The Emperor looked at me. 26 years old. A medic from a species most of the galaxy still considered barely civilized. Standing in front of the ruler of one of the oldest empires in known space. And he said one word. Again. I didn't understand at first. Orson had to explain. The Emperor was ordering me back to the medical chamber to touch his daughter a second time, not as punishment, as a test. Every survival instinct I owned told me to refuse, to demand contact with my delegation, to invoke whatever thin diplomatic protection a human corporal might carry aboard a foreign warship. But then I thought about the girl on the table, the gray skin, the dark veins, the sound the drone made when the light came back, that rising tone, like it was asking permission to hope. Yes, I said, I'll do it. That's how it started. I didn't sleep that night. They moved me to a guarded room beside the medical chamber, an upgrade, technically softer bed, but nothing that mattered to my nerves. 2 guards outside my door, no contact with my delegation. Not a prisoner, not free either. Something that the Thessari didn't have a word for yet. A tool they didn't trust. The first supervised session happened at what my internal clock called early morning, though ship time on the Radiant Ascendant followed a cycle I never fully understood. Orson waited with 4 assistants, scanning equipment that probably cost more than my entire education. The room had partial power now. Warmer. The crystalline panels gave off a dim amber glow. Solène lay exactly as I'd found her. Gray, cracked, motionless. Orson positioned me beside the table, directed my hands to the same spot as before, counted down in Thessari. 3, 2, 1. I touched her. Nothing happened. Not immediately. I stood there, palms flat against cold, rough skin. 10 seconds. 20. The monitors stayed stubbornly silent. I started to wonder if the first time had been a fluke, a one-time miracle that would never repeat, and that I'd be executed after all for something that only worked once. Then I felt it. Warmth, faint, like holding your palm over a candle from across the room. The gray beneath my fingers softened, cracks closing slow the way ice melts at the edges first. And the monitors woke up screaming. 0.4%, Orson said. Faster than yesterday. 3 sessions that day, 10 minutes each. By the third, the total reversal in the contact zone had reached 1.8%. Doesn't sound like much. Except Orson pulled me aside afterward, and his voice had lost every trace of professional distance. In 43 days of treatment using the most advanced medicine this empire has ever produced, the cumulative reversal across every method has been 0. Exactly 0. Until a human hand touched her skin. Tell me what you're doing, he said. Not a question. A plea. I don't know, I said. I'm not doing anything. I'm just touching her. He ran scans on me for 2 hours after that. Blood, skin, bioelectric output, cellular respiration, compared against a database holding medical profiles for 12,000 known species. When he finished, he sat in silence for a long time, all six hands flat on the console. Then he told me what he'd found. Every living thing generates a bioelectric field, basic biology, nerve impulses, muscle contractions, chemical reactions at the molecular level. In most species, that field is faint, irregular, background noise. Human fields are different, not stronger, different. Ours oscillates at a frequency Orson measured, then stared at for 10 straight minutes because it sat almost exactly on the baseline resonance the SARI cells use to talk to each other. The SARI communicate through bioluminescent micropulses. It's how their bodies coordinate, how their immune systems work, how organs stay synchronized. The Ashen Fate attacks that communication, scrambles the signal, static drowning out a radio broadcast until the cells can no longer hear each other and start shutting down one at a time. My field, the one every cell in my body produces without asking permission, reads to the SARI cells like a reset command, not a cure, a reset, like pressing restart on a frozen machine. My field wasn't telling her cells what to do, it was reminding them how to listen. No other species in this database produces this frequency, Orson said. Not one out of 12,000. Uniquely, inexplicably human. You don't even know you carry this, he said. We didn't know aliens existed 11 years ago, I said. We're still catching up. The politics move faster than the science. Words spread through the court like fire through dry paper. And the court split right down the middle in ways I was only beginning to understand. One side saw providence, miracle, proof the universe had a design, that humanity's arrival was an accident but purpose. The romantics, the ones who'd watched their princess dying and prayed for something impossible. The other side saw humiliation, 600,000 years of civilization. They mapped genomes before we discovered fire, folded space before we crossed an ocean. And now a species barely out of the caves was doing something their entire medical establishment couldn't. Not just failure, insult. Threnor stood firmly, loudly, dangerously on that second side. I saw him again 3 days into the sessions, escorted through the upper gallery toward a dining hall reserved for medical staff. He stepped directly into my path, 2 guards flanking him. He was tall enough I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes. And what I found there wasn't anger. Anger I could have handled. What I found was contempt so deep it had calcified into something like philosophy. The creature that heals through clumsiness, he said. My implant flattened the venom out of his voice, but I still felt it land. Tell me, human, when they finally dissect you to extract whatever chemical produces this effect, will you stumble then too? I said nothing. Training, neutral posture, do not escalate. I held his gaze until he moved past me, muttering something my implant refused to translate. It didn't need to. Here's something I never told Orson. Never told anyone on that ship. Back on Earth, before any of this, I served 2 years on a disaster response unit. Flood rescue, structural collapse. The kind of work where you don't get medals, you just get names. Names of people you couldn't reach in time. One of them was a woman named Danvers. Search and rescue. She went into a collapsing structure to pull out a family that wasn't going to make it without her. She got 3 of them out. She didn't come out herself. I was 23. I stood at the edge of that site for 6 hours after because some part of me refused to accept that going in and not coming out was something that could actually happen to a person that competent, that careful, that good at her job. I never talked about Danvers, not to command, not to the delegation psych evaluators who cleared me for this assignment. I filed it somewhere quiet and kept working because that's what you do. You keep moving toward the wounded because stopping to grieve properly means admitting how much it costs every single time. I thought about her the night before the second contact session, lying awake in a guarded room on an alien warship staring at an amber ceiling panel. Danvers went in anyway. I understood for the first time in 3 years exactly why. Sessions kept going, 3 a day, numbers climbing. Orson filled data crystals the way other people fill notebooks. Solène started waking for longer stretches, an hour, then two, each period sharper than the last. Her translator implant came back online on day 9. First thing she said through it, "You're much smaller than I expected." "I get that a lot," I said. "From your own species, no. Just here." She almost smiled. Not a human smile, the sorry don't do that, but her veins pulsed a soft amber, and the cracked skin around her mouth smoothed slightly. I learned that day amber meant something close to laughter. She asked about Earth, not the population data, not the resource inventories the galactic community used to file us away. She wanted to know what things felt like. I told her about rain. She'd never felt liquid water fall from a sky. Thesari worlds had moisture cycles, crystalline condensation, nothing like it. I described standing in a downpour, the sound on a roof, the smell of wet ground afterward. She listened with an intensity that unsettled me until I understood what it was. She'd spent 40 days expecting to die. Every sensation I described was something she'd believed she'd never experience again. She wasn't just listening, she was collecting. I told her about dogs. She found the concept baffling, a species that domesticated a predator through affection, then let it sleep on the bed. She said this explained a great deal about humanity's reputation for irrational bravery. I told her about cooking, fire, meat, the way humans gather around heat and food as ritual. She was equal parts horrified and fascinated. Thesari absorbed nutrients through a bioluminescent process, no preparation, no fire, no gathering required. "The most aggressively human thing I've heard yet," she said. In return, she told me about the resonance gardens on her homeworld. Crystal formations old enough to still carry the frequencies of Thesari, who'd lived millions of years ago. "Walk through them," she said, "and you could hear the hum of your ancestors in the stone." She'd visited every year since she was old enough to walk. She told me she thought she'd never hear it again. There was one evening near the end of that first week of real conversation when she reached for something in the drawer beside her bed. A small case tucked among bandages and diagnostic leads, like it had been hidden there on purpose. She didn't open it, just rested her hand on top of it for a moment. "My mother gave this to me before she died," she said. "I don't open it often. It reminds me of a version of myself I'm not sure I'll get back." She didn't explain further. I didn't ask. Some doors you learn to leave closed until someone's ready to open them themselves. There was a moment, I remember this one clearly because it's the moment everything shifted, though I didn't have the words for it yet, where neither of us spoke. She was sitting up in the medical bed. Progress good enough that Orson had actually clapped 2 of his 6 hands together. We watched the stars through the viewport. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. The kind of silence you share with someone when words would only get in the way of what you're both already feeling. And what we were both feeling, though, neither of us said it was the simple, staggering gratitude of being alive in the same room at the same time. She wasn't human. Her eyes were too large. Her skin shifted color with her mood. She'd been alive longer than my grandparents from a civilization that considered mine barely above infancy. None of it mattered. Because underneath the biology, the culture, the distance, I recognized something in her I'd felt in myself for years without naming it. Loneliness, the specific kind. Surrounded by people who care about you but can't reach you. Who love you but can't understand the shape of the dark living in your chest. She'd been dying alone in a room full of people who would have given anything to save her. I'd been alive and well on a ship full of people who saw me as a footnote in a diplomatic file. Different isolation, same silence underneath. I didn't say any of that out loud. I think she knew anyway. The threat arrived on the 16th day. I was in my quarters reviewing the day's readings when my door chime sounded. I expected Orson. Instead, I found a Thesari I didn't recognize. Tall, lean veins pulsing a steady, unreadable gray. He introduced himself as Counselor Ilias. senior member of the Royal Court's Strategic Advisory Body. Polite, excessively polite. The kind humans use right before delivering very bad news so no one can accuse them of being rude about it. Elias told me Prince Threnor had been in communication with the Vrel Dominion. I knew the name. Older than the Thessari's closest rivals. Younger than the Thessari themselves, but old enough and skilled enough in one specific discipline that mattered a great deal right now: biological engineering. Their entire civilization was built on identifying useful traits in other species, then extracting them, replicating them, weaponizing them if the price was right. 100,000 years of practice. They were very, very good at it. Threnor had shared intelligence about my bioelectric signature, about the frequency, about what it did to Thessari cells, and the Vrel were interested how I asked, though I already knew. Ilyas paused the way diplomats pause when they want to convey severity without using alarming words. The Dominion has formally requested access to human biological samples. For research, they want to study me. They want to study your species, he said. You would be the beginning. I sat with that for a long time after he left. I thought about what it meant to carry something inside you that you never knew was there. Something you couldn't feel, couldn't control, couldn't understand, and to discover the galaxy considered it valuable enough to take by force. Then Ilias's second piece of information hit harder than the first. Threnor wasn't just leaking intelligence outward. He was building a case inward. He'd retained legal scholars to research an ancient Thessari statute, the doctrine of biological salvage, 200,000 years old, written to govern the use of beneficial biological material discovered on conquered worlds. Under that doctrine, if a trait was found to have medicinal or strategic value, the organism carrying it could be reclassified. Not a person, a resource. It hadn't been invoked in over 50,000 years. Threnor was trying to bring it back. If he succeeded, I wouldn't be a guest, wouldn't be a prisoner. I'd be property, a biological commodity sampled and replicated on a schedule that didn't require my consent because my consent would cease to legally exist. I sat alone with that for 3 hours. I thought about my options. I could request extraction. My delegation had been asking about me for days. The ambassador had the authority to pull me out. I could be on a shuttle back to human space within hours. But Solène was at 40% recovery. 40%. Orson had told me in his last briefing that her recovery had entered a critical dependency phase. My field wasn't just resetting her cells anymore. It had become part of the stabilization process her biology relied on. If I left now, if that signal disappeared, the relapse wouldn't be gradual. It would be catastrophic. I could leave and live. Or I could stay and risk becoming something less than human in the eyes of a law written before my species existed. I was still sitting with that choice when my door opened and Solène walked in. Walked. Not carried. Not supported by machinery. On her own legs, slow, careful, one hand resting on a cane made of light. A Thessari medical device, low-intensity energy field providing structural support. Her skin had gone pale silver. Not yet the shimmering vitality of a healthy Thessari, but a color that belonged to the living. She stood in my doorway and looked at me, and I understood she already knew. Maybe not the details, but the shape of it. She'd grown up in this court. She understood its politics better than I ever would. "You're thinking about leaving," she said. "I'm thinking about what happens if I stay." She came inside, sat beside me. The cane dimmed as she settled her weight. Quiet for a moment, then steady in a way I hadn't heard from her before. "My brother will try to own you." A pause. "The Vrel will try to take you." Another pause. "My father will try to use you." She looked at me directly. "I am the only one on this ship asking you nothing." I looked at her. She was wrong about that last part. She was asking me everything. She just didn't know it yet. Or maybe she did, and that was the point. "I'm staying," I said. She didn't thank me, didn't express relief or gratitude or any of the emotions the moment might have called for. She just nodded, and the light in her veins pulsed once, a deep, warm amber. The color I'd learned to read as trust. She left. I sat alone again. But the silence was different now. Not the silence of a man weighing his options. The silence of a man who had already chosen, who understood exactly what the choice would cost, and who found somewhat to his own surprise that he was at peace with the price. I didn't sleep that night either. But for the first time since I'd stumbled into that medical chamber, it wasn't fear keeping me awake. Somewhere down the corridor, Threnor was drafting a legal argument that would call me a resource instead of a man. Somewhere beyond this ship, the Vrel were already preparing their delegation. And somewhere inside me, quiet, stubborn, refusing to be talked out of it, was the same voice that had kept me standing at the edge of a collapsed building 6 hours after everyone told me to go home. You don't leave, not when someone's still fighting that hard to live. I didn't know yet how far Threnor was willing to go. I didn't know the Vrel were already 3 days from docking. I only knew one thing, lying in the dark on an alien warship 26 years old, and further from home than any human had ever been. I wasn't leaving. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Part 2, The Trap in the Storm. The Vrel delegation arrived on the 22nd day. They arrived with the kind of theatrical precision that told me this visit had been planned long before the invitation went out. Their ship docked through an umbilical corridor that sealed with a hiss I felt in my back teeth. Within the hour, 6 Vrel diplomats stood in the reception hall of the Radiant Ascendant, wrapped in biosynthetic robes that shifted color to match the walls around them, smiling, with mouths that held too many teeth. I'd never seen a Vrel in person. The briefings called them roughly humanoid, which was technically true. The way calling a shark roughly fish-shaped is technically true. Tall, elongated limbs, skin with the wet, reflective quality of something grown rather than born, and eyes, compound eyes, dozens of tiny lenses clustered where a single eye should sit, each one moving independently, which meant when a Vrel looked at you, it was looking at dozens of versions of you, all at once. Their leader introduced himself as Envoy Zarven. He bowed to the Emperor, praised the beauty of the ship, expressed concern for the princess's health with a sincerity so perfectly calibrated, it looped all the way around from convincing to unsettling. Everything about him was polished. Everything about him was wrong. I wasn't supposed to be present for the reception. I definitely wasn't supposed to be present for anything involving the Vrel. Except that morning a summons arrived with no explanation delivered by a guard who wouldn't meet my eyes. So I put on my cleanest uniform and walked into a room full of people who wanted different pieces of my body, none of which I intended to give. Here's the thing nobody tells you about danger. It doesn't announce itself with a growl or a raised weapon. Sometimes it announces itself with a floating scanner disc and a voice smooth enough to sell you your own funeral. Corporal Rourke. Zarven's voice carried across the hall like it already owned the room. The galaxy speaks of your remarkable contribution to Thessari medicine. Surely you would not object to a brief examination. In the spirit of interstellar cooperation. He didn't wait for my answer. The scanner orbited me. Chest, arms, neck. Data scrolling across its surface in symbols I couldn't read. Zarven studied the readings with those compound eyes, each lens recalibrating independently, and made small sounds of appreciation. Performed. For the audience. Then one of his aides stepped forward and placed a bare hand against my neck. Cold, damp, not a scan, not a device. Skin against skin, and something pulsed through the contact, not physical, but biological. Like the aide was trying to read something written directly into my cells. I slapped the hand away. The sound rang through the reception hall like a gunshot. Every head turned. Human. Thessari. Vrel. All of it landed on me at once. The aide stumbled back, more surprised than force, and Zarven's compound eyes locked onto a single point for the first time. My face. The silence that followed was the loudest silence I have ever lived through. I am not a resource, I said, My voice held steady, which surprised me because nothing else in my body was steady. Hands shaking, heart hammering against my ribs like it wanted out. I am not a compound to be sampled. I am a medic from a planet you couldn't have found on a star chart 2 decades ago. And I will break every finger on the next hand that touches me without asking. Zarven's expression didn't change. His eyes shifted, each lens recalculating. When he spoke again, the same polished courtesy sat on top of his voice, except something colder moved underneath it now. A spirited response, he said. Understandable. Younger species often confuse boundaries with aggression. He turned to the Emperor. Perhaps a more structured arrangement would be preferable. We are prepared to offer significant concessions in exchange for access to human biological data. The Dominion's research capabilities could benefit the Thesari greatly. The Emperor said nothing. His veins pulsed a deep, unreadable blue. And somewhere behind me, though, I couldn't see his face, I knew Prince Thranor was smiling. Thranor moved within hours. He convened an emergency session of the Royal Council before the day cycle ended, using the reception hall incident as his opening argument. A human had committed an act of aggression against a foreign diplomat on Thesari's sovereign territory. Not an isolated event, he argued. A pattern. Humans were volatile, unpredictable, incapable of functioning inside the frameworks of civilized space. They couldn't be trusted as partners. They could only be managed as assets. He presented the doctrine of biological salvage. His legal scholars had spent weeks preparing the case, and they laid it out with the kind of meticulous, airtight logic that made it almost impossible to argue against on technical grounds. 200,000 years old, never formally repealed, broad enough to cover any biological trait deemed beneficial to the Thesari state. And my frequency was by any reasonable measure beneficial. Under the doctrine, I would stop being a diplomatic observer. I would become a biological resource. My consent legally irrelevant. My delegation's protest legally irrelevant. Half the council supported him. Not because they agreed with the principle, because they were afraid. The Vrel were powerful. Their non-aggression pact with the Thesari held up a fragile regional peace. If the Thesari refused to share the data, the Vrel might read it as provocation. And if the Vrel decided to take what they wanted by force, the cost would be measured in worlds, not lives. Worlds. The Emperor listened, asked questions, consulted advisors. He did not decide. I want to tell you what I did that night because it matters. Because everyone assumes I sat in my quarters and waited to find out whether I'd be declared a person or a possession. I didn't wait. I set a trap. Here's what I knew. Thranor had access to my medical file, Orsan's daily readings, the raw bioelectric data, everything. What he didn't have was direct access to me. Every conversation, every session ran through official channels, which meant if I wanted to know exactly how deep his arrangement with the Vrel went, I needed him to reach for something himself. So I asked Orsan for something specific. A copy of my session data, real data, but altered by exactly one number. A frequency variance that didn't exist. Something that if leaked to a species obsessed with biological engineering, would look like the key to replicating the effect artificially. Except it was garbage. A dead end dressed up as a discovery. I gave it to a junior court clerk I'd overheard complaining twice about being underpaid and overworked, and squarely under Thranor's supervision. I made sure the file crossed her desk in a way that looked careless. Not planted. Careless is what people believe. Planted is what people question. Then I waited. 3 days. Because that's the part nobody tells you about laying a trap. The waiting doesn't feel clever. It feels like sitting in a room with your own heartbeat, wondering if you just handed a weapon to the person most likely to use it on you. On the 3rd day, Ilias came to my door again. Same excessive politeness, same careful pauses. The falsified frequency data, he said, was transmitted to a Vrel relay 2 hours after it reached the clerk's desk. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, even though I'd expected exactly this. Prince Thraenor's authorization code, Ilias continued, was used to clear the transmission. There it was. Not intelligence gathered secondhand, not suspicion built on tone and posture. Proof. Direct. Traceable. A prince of the Thessari Empire caught handing a foreign power falsified but clearly stolen human biological data using his own credentials because he'd been so certain no one on the ship was smart enough to catch him. "Does the Emperor know?" I asked. "Not yet," Ilias said. "I wanted you to know first, because you're the one who built the trap. You deserve to see it close." I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. The specific exhaustion of watching a plan work exactly the way you designed it and realizing that working exactly the way you designed it doesn't make anyone safer yet. It just means the next move is coming faster. I was right. The threat arrived on the 30th day, which for the record was faster than I expected, and I'd expected fast. I was in my quarters reviewing data when the lights cut out. Not dimmed, cut. The specific, absolute darkness that tells you something has been deliberately disabled. I was on my feet before I was fully awake. Training taking over where consciousness hadn't caught up yet. The door opened. Not the chime that precedes a normal entry. The hard, mechanical groan of an override. Two figures. Not Thessari. Betrayal. I recognized the wet, reflective skin even in flickering emergency light. The compound eyes catching the glow and throwing it back in fractured points. They move fast. Faster than their height should have allowed. One of them carried a device that hummed with the same frequency I'd felt against my neck in the reception hall. I dropped low, rolled sideways as the first one reached for me. Field medic training includes basic close-quarters defense. Not enough to fight a trained soldier. Enough to buy 10 seconds. I put the bed between us, grabbed the console table, shoved it into the path of the first Vrel, hit him at knee height, and he stumbled, and I used the half second that bought me to get through the door. The corridor outside was dark too. Entire sections of the ship dead, and in the flickering emergency light I could see the shapes of Thessari guards on the floor. Unconscious, not dead. Their bioluminescent veins dimmed to almost nothing. Whatever the Vrel used to neutralize them was thorough. Precise. I ran. Behind me pursuit. 2 Vrel, then 3. Then 4 emerging from side corridors with the coordinated efficiency of a team that had rehearsed this extraction many times. They were hurting me. I understood that too late. Turned a corner into a wide junction that led straight to the shuttle bay. 2 more Vrel waited there. One of them hit me with something that wasn't a weapon in any conventional sense. My muscles turned to water. I dropped like a puppet with the strings cut. They picked me up. I couldn't resist. My body had stopped taking orders from me, and I hung between 2 of them like dead-weight feet dragging across the crystal floor, moving toward a Vrel shuttle docked at an unauthorized port. My mind was screaming. My body said nothing at all. The corridor stretched ahead like a tunnel with no end. Then the lights came back. Not the normal lights, not the emergency lights. Violet, deep, blazing, filling the corridor from floor to ceiling, and the air itself began to vibrate with a frequency I could feel in my bones and my blood, in the space between my own thoughts. Solène stood at the far end of the corridor. She wasn't fully healed. I could see the effort it cost her just to stand, the tremor in her legs, the cane abandoned somewhere behind her, but her bioluminescence was ablaze. Every vein in her body lit with the full royal frequency so intense, the Vrel recoiled, their compound eyes contracting in pain. She stood in the violet glow of her own biology, and she was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. Not because of what she was doing, because of what it was clearly costing her. Every second of that display was burning through weeks of recovery. She knew it. She did it anyway. She released the burst. I don't have adequate words for what happened next, because the English language wasn't built for this. The frequency filled the corridor like water filling a tank, and the Vrel went down. All of them. At once. Compound eyes flickering, limbs twitching, robes going dark. Their biology couldn't process it. I should have gone down too. The frequency should have overwhelmed my human nervous system exactly the way it overwhelmed theirs. It didn't. It washed over me like a warm current, intense, not harmful. And I understood, even through the fog of whatever the Vrel had used on me, what she'd done. She calibrated the burst, shaped it around my own bioelectric signature, carving out a space inside the resonance where my biology could exist untouched. She'd learned my rhythm. Weeks of sessions, weeks of quiet conversations in front of a viewport. She'd been listening to my frequency the same way I'd been offering hers. And now she was using it to keep me safe inside a storm she'd built with her own body. The last Vrel fell. The violet light flickered, and Solène collapsed. My muscles were still recovering from whatever they'd hit me with, but I caught her. I felt the bioelectric exchange running between us in both directions. Not just my field resetting hers, but hers stabilizing something in me I hadn't known was broken. Warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. Everything to do with the fact that two living beings were holding each other in a dark corridor and refusing for one more second to let go. I want to be honest about what went through my mind in that corridor, because it wasn't heroic and it wasn't romantic. It was closer to panic, because her skin had already lost its silver warmth again, because her veins were dimming under my hands in real time, because I could actually feel through the connection her burst had built between us the exact moment her body started running on debt instead of reserves. She'd burned through weeks of healing. For me, I held her there, surrounded by unconscious Vrel in the fading afterglow of the most powerful thing I'd ever witnessed. And I thought about what I'd been before I stumbled onto this ship. A nobody, a corporal, a medic with a clipboard and a seat in the back of the room. I'd become a miracle. Then a prisoner, then a specimen. Now holding a princess who just spent a month of her own recovery to keep a stranger from being taken apart by strangers, I became something else. Someone worth saving back. Orson found us 3 minutes later, leading a security team restoring power to the compromised sections. He scanned Solène, and his face went tight with something I recognized immediately as controlled despair. Then he looked at the unconscious Vrel on the floor, and his expression changed to something I'd never seen on a Thessari face before. Fury. Pure, ancient, six-armed fury. He ordered Solène taken to the medical chamber, ordered the Vrel to the brig. Then he looked at me, still kneeling where she'd collapsed. Stay with her. I didn't need to be told twice. The next 4 days were the worst of my life. Worse than the floor. Worse than the weapon against my neck. Because this time there was nothing dramatic to survive, no guard to talk down, no trap to spring. Just numbers on a monitor falling and my hands on her arms, doing whatever quiet, useless offering they knew how to do. Orson worked through the entire cycle, adjusting frequencies, running treatments, trying to compensate for damage she'd inflicted on herself to save a man she'd known for 30 days. I sat beside the table the whole time. Because leaving wasn't an option I let myself consider. Because if I stood up, if I walked away, even to eat or sleep, some part of me was convinced the numbers would fall faster the second my hands left her skin, which was probably not medically accurate. Except it didn't feel optional. It felt like the only thing keeping the floor from opening under both of us. By the end of those 4 days, the decline had stabilized. Not reversed. Stabilized. Suspended somewhere between recovery and collapse, waiting for something, anything to tip the balance one direction or the other. Orson found me still sitting there when the numbers finally leveled off. He didn't say anything encouraging. The Sari don't do encouraging the way humans do. He just said there is a window now, a narrow one. What happens in the next 72 hours will decide whether her body can hold this line on its own or whether we lose her the way we nearly did before. And then he left me alone with her. Alone with the machines. Alone with the sound of my own heartbeat and hers faint and uneven under the monitors and the violet light in her veins burning low. Low, but not out. The political fallout from the raid moved faster than I had energy left to track. An armed Vrel team had breached a Thessari royal cruiser. Incapacitated sovereign military personnel attempted to abduct a guest of the imperial court. Under galactic law, that wasn't a diplomatic incident anymore. It was an act of aggression against a sovereign state. The Emperor responded accordingly. Envoy Tsar Ven and the entire delegation were expelled within hours. The non-aggression pact between the Thessari Empire and the Vrel Dominion, 8,000 years old, suspended pending full investigation. Tsar Ven protested, of course, claimed the extraction team acted without authorization, claimed the Dominion had no knowledge of the operation. Rogue elements, he said, nothing official. The Emperor listened to all of it with an expression my translator rendered as contempt. I suspected the real word was older and far more dangerous. But underneath the expulsion, underneath the suspended treaty, sat the piece of evidence that mattered most. The clerk's file. The falsified frequency data, transmitted using Prince Threnor's own authorization code 2 hours after it landed on a desk he controlled. Proof, not suspicion, not court gossip. Proof that his own son had handed a hostile power the exact intelligence that made the raid possible. Ilyas brought the full report to the Emperor himself. I wasn't in the room for that. I was still sitting beside a table with a girl whose veins burned low and uneven, watching numbers that refused to commit to either direction. But I heard later that the Emperor read the report twice and said nothing at all for a very long time. On the second of those newly opened 72 hours, her hand moved, just barely, fingers curling faint around my wrist. I froze, didn't dare hope, didn't dare not hope either. Her eyes opened, unfocused first, drifting, then finding me. You look terrible, she whispered. My throat closed up so fast I almost couldn't answer. You should see the other species I managed. Her veins pulsed amber, faint, weak, but amber. Behind me, I heard Orson make a sound I'd never heard from a Thessari before. The sound I realized of 6 centuries of composure finally cracking into something like relief. But the story wasn't over, not yet. Because somewhere in this ship, Threnor's authorization code sat in an evidence file waiting for the Emperor to decide what a father does with a son who'd nearly gotten the woman he loved killed twice. And somewhere beyond this ship, the Vrel Dominion was already deciding how it planned to answer for a failed extraction and a suspended treaty. And somewhere in my own chest, underneath the relief of hearing her voice again, sat a question I hadn't let myself ask yet. What happens to a medic who just admitted to himself in a dark medical bay on an alien warship that he'd rather lose everything than lose her I didn't know yet? I only knew the numbers had stopped falling. For now. Part 3, The Standing Emperor. The remaining hours of that 72-hour window passed the way the worst hours always do. Slowly and then all at once. Orson made the stakes clear from the start. Stabilizing wasn't the same as safe. The numbers could still tip either direction, and he needed every one of those hours to know which way her body would finally settle. I didn't leave her side. Not for meals, not for sleep that mattered. Not even when a guard came to tell me the Emperor had summoned Prince Threnor to a private audience. I heard about that meeting secondhand, which is probably for the best because I don't think I could have sat through it without saying something that got me executed after all. Orson told me later. Ilyas told me the rest. The Emperor didn't shout. Thessari rulers don't shout. I'd learned that much by now. Anger moves through them the way weather moves through mountains, slow and total, and impossible to argue with once it arrives. He laid the evidence on the table between them. The clerk's file, the transmission log, Threnor's own authorization code used to hand a hostile power the exact data that made an armed raid on his own sister possible. Explain this, the Emperor said. And here's the thing about Threnor that I want you to understand because it matters more than anything else in this story. He didn't deny it. He didn't even flinch. I was protecting this empire, he said. From a species we don't understand. Wearing the face of a hero because it healed one girl by accident. Your sister, the Emperor said. My sister is a symptom, Threnor said. The disease is what happens when 600,000 years of order bends itself around one human's convenience. Silence. Ilyas told me the silence lasted almost a full minute. which on a ship where every conversation moves at the speed of ancient diplomacy is close to an eternity. Then the Emperor spoke again. Quiet. Final. You gave our enemies the key to our own daughter's biology because you could not accept that a stranger succeeded where our empire failed. I gave them nothing they wouldn't have taken eventually, Threnor said. I simply chose the timing. You chose treason, the Emperor said, and dressed it as strategy. I wasn't in the room, but I've thought about that exchange more times than I can count because it's the moment the story stopped being about me at all. It became about what an empire does with a son who breaks its foundations rather than admit the foundations needed to change. Threnor was stripped of his council seat that night, his military rank, his access to every communication channel in the empire. He wasn't imprisoned. Something colder. He was assigned to a border garrison in a system so distant that light from the Thessari homeworld would take years to reach it. Not punishment dressed as mercy, duty dressed as exile. He left the Radiant Ascendant on the 5th day after the raid. I watched his shuttle depart from the upper gallery because some part of me needed to see it happen with my own eyes before I let myself believe it. He didn't look back at the ship. He didn't send a message. Not to his father, not to Solène, not to me. And I felt watching that shuttle shrink into the dark, something that wasn't triumph and wasn't relief either. It was recognition. Because men like Threnor don't accept defeat. They store it. Solène's recovery held through the rest of the window Orson had given her. Barely at first, the numbers crawling instead of climbing Orson, checking readings so often I started timing his visits without meaning to. Then near the end of it, something shifted. Not dramatically, just steadily. The kind of steady that doesn't make for a good headline, but makes for an actual life. By the end of that first full week, her skin had regained real color. Not the ash gray, not even the pale silver from before. Something closer to the shimmering vitality Orson described in his clinical way as appropriate for a Thessari of her age and station. I told her that sounded like a compliment wrapped in a medical chart. She told me most Thessari compliments were. We fell into something during those weeks that I didn't have a name for. Not romance exactly, not yet though. I'd stopped pretending the feeling wasn't there. Something quieter. A rhythm. Sessions in the morning, conversation in the evening, and somewhere in between the specific comfort of sitting beside someone who no longer needed saving every single hour of every single day. She asked me once during one of those evenings why I hadn't left when Ilias warned me about the Vrel. Would you have left? I asked. I am the crown princess of an empire, she said. Leaving isn't a luxury I'm offered. That's not what I asked. She was quiet for a moment. Her veins pulsed something new, not amber, not the deep violet of calm. Something I hadn't learned to read yet. No, she finally said. I wouldn't have left either. She reached for the same small case she'd rested her hand on that one evening weeks earlier, back when I'd first noticed it and asked nothing. This time she opened it. A trinket, silver-shaped like a coiled thread of light, small enough to fit in a closed palm. This belonged to my mother, she said, and her mother before that. It doesn't do anything remarkable. It doesn't heal. It doesn't fight. It only holds a very small charge of resonance enough to recognize its owner and no one else. She placed it in my hand. It's recognizing you now. I didn't know what to say to that. So I said nothing, which I was learning is sometimes the correct answer in any language, human or otherwise. On the 45th day, a ship arrived that wasn't Thessari, not a diplomatic courier, not an observer vessel, a warship. The Radiant Ironclad carrying Admiral Isolde Draycott in a formal envoy from Earth's United Council. I'd met Draycott exactly once years earlier during a training review. A compact woman with steel gray hair cut short and eyes that communicated more in a single glance than most people manage in a full conversation. She had a reputation across the fleet for being the kind of officer who could declare war with a handshake and somehow make the other side grateful for the experience. She met with me first, alone. No staff, no aides, just the two of us in my quarters, and she looked at me for a long time before she said a word. Tell me everything, she said. So I did. When I finished, she sat quiet for another minute. Then you should have been pulled out of here weeks ago. If I'd been pulled out weeks ago, I said, the princess would be dead. I know, she said. That's the problem. Your biology saved her life. And now the galaxy knows human biology can do something no other species can do. The Vrel were just the first knock on the door. She stood. Stay with the princess. Keep doing what you're doing. I'm going to make sure no one takes you apart to find out how you work. Dracot requested a meeting with Emperor Kalos. Not through intermediaries. She walked to the throne room herself and asked to speak with the ruler of a 600,000-year-old civilization, with the specific audacity of someone who'd stopped asking permission for things a long time ago. The emperor agreed. I wasn't in the room for that meeting either. I learned what happened from Orson, who was, and from Dracot herself, who debriefed me afterward with the same flat matter-of-fact clarity she used for everything, as if reshaping the political landscape of the galaxy was simply another item on a checklist. Dracot presented a doctrine. She called it the sovereign biology principle. Its core assertion was simple, and she delivered it the way other people deliver a weather report. No species may be commodified, detained, harvested, or biologically exploited for traits inherent to their physiology, regardless of the potential benefit those traits offer to other civilizations. A species' biology belongs to that species alone. It cannot be conquered, cannot be claimed, cannot be purchased. And consent is never optional. This wasn't a request. It wasn't a petition from an infant species asking the adults in the room for protection. It was a declaration. The Emperor asked what enforcement Earth intended to bring to such a principle. Dracot's answer was immediate. Every means available to us. The room went silent after that. Orson told me the Emperor studied her for a long time and that during the silence his veins shifted through colors Orson had never seen in 200 years of service. Then the Emperor asked one question. If I reject this doctrine, what becomes of the human who saved my daughter? He comes home, Dracot said, and every human currently serving in any joint program with the Thessari Empire comes home with him, and every diplomatic channel between our species closes. And the galaxy learns that the Thessari consider persons to be property when the biology in question is useful enough. The Emperor looked at Dracot, then at Orson, then at the empty seat where his eldest son used to sit. And then he did something no Thessari Emperor had done in the recorded history of the galactic community. He stood, not a metaphor. He physically rose from the throne, an act so significant in Thessari protocol that Orson actually took a step backward, telling me about it like the memory itself still carried weight. Because a Thessari Emperor sits to command, he stands to recognize someone as worthy of being seen at their full height. He ratified the sovereign biology principle, not as a concession to a junior species, not as a diplomatic compromise, as a declaration of shared principle between two empires who had just decided for the first time in galactic history that 11 years of civilization and 600,000 could stand on the same ground. When Dracot told me this, her voice stayed as flat and professional as ever, but her eyes were brighter than I'd ever seen them. And when she finished, she put a hand on my shoulder. "Good work, Corporal," she said. "Try not to trip over anything else. Here's the part I need you to understand because it's the part that mattered most to me, more than the doctrine, more than the ceremony, more than anything. Dracot and the Emperor worked out between them in that throne room. Dracot offered me a permanent position, advisor to the human delegation, full diplomatic status, protection that would follow me for the rest of my life wherever the fleet sent me next. I turned it down, not because I didn't want protection, because I wanted something bigger than protection for myself alone. There are 11 other humans serving joint postings across this sector, I told her. Field techs, junior officers, people without the accident that happened to put my name in a history file. If this doctrine only protects the human the galaxy already noticed, it isn't a principle. It's a favor. And favors expire the moment someone stops finding you useful. Dracot looked at me for a long moment. You're asking me to extend sovereign biology protections to every human serving off-world. Not just you. I'm asking you to make sure this was never about me, I said. It was always about what we do to people when we decide their bodies are worth more than their consent. That doesn't stop mattering just because the cameras move on. She studied me the way Orson had studied me on the very first night, like she was trying to work out whether I actually believed what I was saying or whether exhaustion had simply worn down my filter. Then she nodded. I'll take it back to the council, she said. For what it's worth, I think you just made this doctrine mean something instead of just sound like something. It took 3 more days for the amendment to formalize. 3 days where I sat beside Solen's bed and told her what I'd asked for and watched her veins pulse a color I now recognized without needing Orson to translate it. Pride. Quiet, steady pride. You could have taken the protection, she said, the status, the safety I could have. I agreed, but you taught me something in that corridor the night the Vrel came for me. What's that? You didn't calibrate that burst to save yourself, I said. You calibrated it to save me at a cost you knew you couldn't afford. I figured I owed the same math to 11 strangers I've never met. She was quiet for a long moment. That she finally said is the most aggressively human thing I've heard yet. I laughed. Actually laughed for what felt like the first time in weeks. Solen crossed the 75% recovery threshold on day 50. By day 55, Orson declared her condition self-sustaining. Her cellular network had rebuilt itself around the rhythm my field had provided, but the rebuilt network was stronger than the original, reinforced by whatever synchronization had happened the night of the resonance burst. The ashen fade wasn't gone. Still present at the cellular level, dormant, pushed back into the margins by a biology that had remembered finally how to fight for itself. But it was no longer winning. And Orson believed with the cautious optimism of a physician who had learned the hard way to distrust miracles that it would never win again. She didn't need me anymore. Not medically, not biologically. The reset signal my field had provided for 55 days was no longer necessary. Her cells had learned their own rhythm. They were playing their own music now. I packed my kit. Didn't take long, I'd arrived on this ship with a medic's bag and a change of clothes, and I was leaving with the same plus a data crystal Orson handed me, containing the complete medical record of the treatment. For your scientists, he said, and for you. So you remember what you did. I tripped, I said. Yes, he said. And the galaxy will never be the same because of it. I walked to the shuttle bay. My footsteps echoed down the same corridor where I'd once lain on the floor with her in my arms, where violet light had blazed and Vrel operatives had fallen, and the balance of an entire sector had shifted in the space of a single heartbeat. The scorch marks were still there. No one had cleaned them. I found myself hoping quietly that no one ever would. Solen was waiting at the shuttle bay, dressed in formal Thessari attire for the first time since I'd known her, full silver skin shimmering with real vitality veins, pulsing a steady, confident violet. Her eyes were clear, sharp, fixed on me with an expression that needed no implant to translate. I stopped walking, stood there with my bag over my shoulder looking at her, and she looked back at me, and neither of us spoke for a long moment. My father is appointing a permanent human liaison to the royal court, she finally said. A medical and diplomatic advisor. Someone who understands Thessari biology and human stubbornness in equal measure. Sounds like a terrible job, I said. It is, she said. The pay is offensive, and the princess is difficult. How difficult? She once burned through a month of healing to save a medic who couldn't stop tripping over cables. I looked at her. She looked at me. The light in her veins pulsed amber. I put my bag down. I'll need a bigger room, I said. That can be arranged. We stood there in the shuttle bay, a human and a Thessari. Two people from opposite ends of a galaxy that was still learning what they meant to each other. The stars moved past the observation window, slow and silent and ancient. And for the first time since that power failure knocked me sideways into a corridor I wasn't supposed to enter, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I didn't become a hero, not in the way the word usually gets used. I tripped over a cable. I put my hand on a dying girl, and I couldn't bring myself to let go. That's the whole of it if you strip away everything that came after. But I've learned something standing in the halls of a civilization that existed long before my species learned to walk upright. Humanity's place in this galaxy was never going to be defined by our ships or our weapons or the speed of our engines. It would be defined by the thing no scanner can fully measure, the thing no doctrine protects unless someone insists on it for people who will never be famous enough to protect themselves. 11 years ago, we looked up at the stars and discovered we were the youngest, smallest civilization in a galaxy full of ancient empires. They gave us a seat at the back of the room and told us to be grateful for it. They didn't expect a clumsy medic to trip in the dark, touch a dying girl, and simply refuse to stop. And they didn't expect that same medic to look at a doctrine built to protect just him and ask instead that it protect everyone standing in the dark beside him. That's the part they never see coming. My name is Silas Rourke. I'm a medic. And this is what my hands and, it turns out, my stubbornness were able to do.